You are a worthless parasite. My dad roared. They treated me like dirt for dropping out. They never knew I secretly had $72 million. The next day, I escaped to my private island. Shortly after. My name is Sloane. I am 26 years old now, but whenever the rain starts pouring heavily outside my window, my mind involuntarily drifts back to my childhood in Salem, Oregon. I still feel like that suffocated 18-year-old girl, trapped in a massive, lifeless house where love was not a right, but a highly conditional reward. In my family, college diplomas, academic prestige, and framed certificates hanging perfectly straight on the living room wall meant infinitely more than kindness, passion, or basic human empathy. There was absolutely no room for alternative dreams in my household. There was only the master plan. You graduate with high honors, you get accepted into an Ivy League university, and then you pursue a highly respectable, bulletproof career. Law, medicine, or academia. Anything else was considered an utter, shameful failure. My father, Richard, was a veteran political science professor at a prestigious state university. He was the kind of man who commanded a room just by clearing his throat. He always stood perfectly straight, dressed sharply in tailored tweed jackets even on a lazy Sunday morning, and spoke to his own family as if he were constantly addressing a crowded, intimidating lecture hall. He didn't converse with us, he delivered verdicts. My mother, Margaret, was the principal of the most prominent local high school in our county. She was completely obsessed with appearances, social standing, and neighborhood gossip. She firmly believed that every single mistake or hardship in life could be entirely avoided if people just followed strict discipline, honored tradition, and listened to their superiors. They were the ultimate academic power couple in our small, judgmental circle. And to them, the absolute perfect child, the undisputed golden child, was my older sister, Penelope. Penelope was a prodigy, or at least my parents manufactured her to look like one. She could apparently recite historical documents from memory when she was a toddler, and she got into a top-tier medical school at 18 with a full-ride scholarship. When she announced her acceptance, my parents threw a massive, ridiculously expensive catered party in our backyard. Relatives from all over the country flew in just to pat her on the back. I still remember the clinking of crystal champagne glasses and the smell of expensive roast beef. My father raised his glass, his eyes gleaming with a kind of fierce, overwhelming pride I had never, ever seen directed at me. He called her the absolute future of American medicine. He toasted to her brilliant mind, her dedication, and her flawless execution of the family legacy. And then, later that same evening, he made a passing comment to my uncle, loud enough for me to hear perfectly clearly from the kitchen where I was washing dishes. He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound, and said that online business nonsense, computers, and coding were just blue-collar distractions for people who couldn't handle real intellectual rigor. That comment was a direct, poisoned arrow aimed right at my chest. You see, I didn't hate studying. I wasn't a bad kid. I never snuck out, I never drank, and I kept my grades at a solid B average. But from a very young age, I was infinitely more fascinated by the intricate logic of code and what happened behind a glowing screen than by copying outdated historical theorems into a spiral notebook. The digital world made sense to me. It was clean. It was logical. If you wrote a line of code correctly, it executed perfectly. There were no mind games, no favoritism, no impossible standards to meet. When I was 12 years old, I completely fixed a neighbor's jammed local network in exchange for $10 and a box of chocolate chip cookies. By 15, I was writing actual, complex lines of code, building functional databases and dynamic websites for small local mom-and-pop shops. I even remember fixing the entire school district's server crash over a long holiday weekend when the highly paid IT guy was out of town. I saved them thousands of dollars in emergency tech fees and recovered months of lost student data. I ran all the way home, my chest swelling with pride, thinking my parents would finally look at me the way they looked at Penelope. Instead, when I burst through the front door and told them the news, my mother just frowned at me over her dinner salad, tapping her perfectly manicured nails against the heavy oak table. She didn't even put her fork down. She told me I needed to stop wasting my time and focus strictly on my SAT prep because these little tech hobbies wouldn't get me into a prestigious university. My father was even blunter. He slowly lowered his newspaper, stared at the server architecture diagram I was excitedly trying to show him, and coldly told me that if I wanted to be a lifetime tech support girl answering phones in a cubicle, I should keep it up. But I shouldn't expect a single dime of inheritance or respect from them. I forced a smile, swallowed the huge lump in my throat, and nodded, but my stomach twisted into tight, painful knots. The one thing I was never, ever given in that beautiful, polished house was the fundamental right to simply be myself. Every single meal in our formal dining room was a psychological trial where Penelope's name was repeated like a sacred, unbreakable chant. It was a relentless barrage of updates. We always had to hear about how Penelope was specially chosen to present her research at a Boston medical symposium, or how a famous, widely published surgeon praised her natural leadership potential in front of the entire hospital staff. The air would be thick with admiration. And then, without fail, the attention would suddenly snap to me. Usually, it came with a heavy, disappointed sigh from my mother, asking if I was ready to retake the math section of the college entrance exam for the third time just to bump up my percentile by 2 points. I learned to swallow my food in complete silence, keeping my eyes glued to my plate, retreating to my room as quickly as humanly possible before the interrogation could go any deeper. My bedroom was my only sanctuary, specifically the 3 square feet of desk space hidden in the corner where my beat-up, overheating laptop sat. That machine was a disaster. It sounded like a struggling jet engine when I ran heavy programs. The battery lasted maybe 20 minutes, and the letter E key was completely worn off from overuse, but it was my only window to a world that actually made sense. Like I said, code was pure, unadulterated logic. If a program crashed, there was a specific, traceable reason. You meticulously track down the bug, you rewrite the line, and it works. But in my family, the bug was me, and there was no fixing it. I was just inherently, fundamentally wrong for not wanting to spend a decade in medical school or law school. So, I built an entirely secret life. Late at night, while my parents firmly believed I was fast asleep or diligently studying vocabulary flashcards, I was taking on complex freelance coding gigs under a fake online username. I built automated inventory systems for local hardware stores. I set up secure payment gateways for independent artists selling their work across the state. I was making real money. It was small money, mostly $50 or $100 a project, but it was mine. I vividly remember the absolute, intoxicating thrill of earning my very first $100 from a local bakery that needed a custom ordering system. Holding that crisp bill felt more validating, more real, than any A+ I had ever gotten in advanced history class. It proved I had tangible value in the real world. But hiding a thriving second life in a house monitored by 2 absolute control freaks was virtually impossible. The breaking point happened on a bitterly cold Tuesday night in the dead of winter. It was past 2 in the morning. I was in the middle of migrating a massive, highly complex database for a new, important client, my biggest paying job yet. The deadline was at 6 in the morning. I was deeply focused, wearing oversized headphones playing white noise, typing frantically to ensure the data transfer didn't corrupt. My laptop fan was screaming, but I was in the zone. Suddenly, my bedroom door flew open, hitting the drywall with a loud, violent bang. My father stood there in his dark bathrobe, his face flushed bright red with sheer fury. He had noticed the internet router blinking rapidly down the hall when he got up for a glass of water. Before I could even pull my headphones off my ears to explain myself, he crossed the room in 3 massive, angry strides. He didn't say a single word. He just reached behind my desk, grabbed the thick power cord of my laptop, and violently ripped it right out of the wall socket. Because my battery was completely dead, my screen went pitch black instantly. Hours of unsaved database configurations, intricate queries, and perfectly optimized code vanished into thin air. I physically lost my breath. I jumped up, trying to tell him that I was working, that this was a paying client relying on me, that I could fix this if he just let me plug it back in. He didn't care. He leaned heavily over my desk, trapping me in the corner, his voice a terrifying, low hiss that shook me to my core. He told me I was addicted to a useless, childish toy, that I was actively sabotaging my future, and that from now on, he was personally confiscating my laptop every single night at exactly 9 o'clock. He grabbed the heavy machine, tucked it under his arm, and walked out, slamming the door behind him. I sat there in the pitch-black room for hours, staring at the empty desk. I lost that client the very next morning. They sent a furious email and demanded a refund. But worse than losing the money or the client's trust, I realized with absolute, terrifying clarity that if I stayed in this house, they would slowly, systematically crush every single spark of ambition and identity that made me who I was. I had to get out, no matter the cost. The final, catastrophic explosion finally came in May of my senior year of high school. We were all sitting around the heavy oak dining table for our Sunday roast. My father had arranged a thick stack of glossy college application packets and financial aid forms next to my plate with meticulous, overbearing care. Stanford, Princeton, Yale. He was talking animatedly about early admission strategies, outlining his grand, uncompromising 10-year plan for my life, as if I were a corporate merger he was managing. Penelope was there too, visiting for the weekend from med school, elegantly sipping her red wine with that familiar, infuriatingly condescending smirk on her face. None of those glossy, expensive brochures meant a single thing to me. My heart was racing so fast against my ribs I thought I was going to pass out right into my mashed potatoes. I had secretly managed to save up exactly $4,000 in a hidden bank account from my late-night coding gigs. I had drafted a highly detailed, solid business plan. I had a clear vision for an automated software platform. I took a massive, shaky deep breath, gripping the sharp edge of the dining table until my knuckles turned completely white, and I finally said the words I had been suffocating on for years. I am not applying to college, I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the roaring in my ears. I am going to start my own software business. I already have clients. The silence that followed was completely deafening. It felt like all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the dining room. My mother's heavy silver fork literally clattered onto her fine porcelain plate. Penelope stopped mid-sip, her wine glass hovering near her lips, her eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated disbelief. My father slowly, deliberately stood up from the head of the table. His chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. The air in the room suddenly felt freezing cold. He didn't yell immediately. That was the scariest part. He looked down at me with a profound, chilling disgust, as if I were a cockroach that had just crawled out of his expensive meal. He calmly stated that my little fantasy was absolutely not happening. Not under his roof. Not with his name. I stood my ground, my legs trembling violently under the table. I told him I already had my first few clients lined up, that I had real savings, that I didn't need their tuition money, and that this was my life to live. That was the exact moment the dam utterly broke. The thick veins in his neck visibly bulged. His face turned a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. He slammed both of his fists onto the table so incredibly hard that the water glasses tipped over, spilling ice water everywhere. He roared at the absolute top of his lungs, his voice slicing through the tense air like a jagged razor blade. "You are a worthless parasite," he screamed, his spit flying across the table. The horrific words echoed loudly off the high dining room walls. "You think you're smart? You're nothing but a pathetic high school dropout playing with toys. We gave you everything, and you throw it in our faces. If you walk out that front door tonight, you are completely dead to us. You will fail miserably, and when you are starving and begging on the streets, do not you dare come crawling back to this house. You are an absolute disgrace to this family's name. Get out." I looked desperately over at my mother, praying for an ounce of maternal intervention. She just looked away, staring firmly at her spilled water, actively choosing her husband's pride and her social standing over her own teenage daughter. I looked at Penelope, who just shook her head, rolling her eyes and muttering about how incredibly dramatic, stupid, and ungrateful I was being. I didn't cry. I didn't scream back. A strange, icy, hyper-focused calm washed over my entire body. The heavy, invisible chains that had tied me down to their crushing expectations simply snapped in half. I quietly pushed my chair back, stood up without a word, and walked upstairs to my room. I pulled out 3 cheap, fabric suitcases from the back of my closet. I systematically packed my everyday clothes, my coding books, and my overheating laptop. Nothing else. I didn't take the expensive gold jewelry they had given me for my birthdays, or the designer winter coat my mother had bought to make me look presentable at her school functions. An hour later, I carried my heavy bags heavily down the wooden stairs. The house was completely, eerily silent. They were sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the television, aggressively pretending I didn't exist. They honestly thought I was just throwing a childish tantrum and would unpack by morning with my tail between my legs. I walked to the heavy front door, opened it, stepped out into the freezing, relentless Oregon rain, and closed it firmly behind me. It locked with a loud click. No one came out to see me off. No one yelled goodbye. I loaded my soaking wet bags into the trunk of a rusty, high-mileage sedan I had bought from a friend's older brother for $500 in cash, turned the unreliable key, and drove away into the pitch-black night. I was utterly terrified. I was completely alone, but for the very first time in my entire life, I was finally breathing my own air. My very first taste of glorious, terrifying freedom was a third-floor walk-up apartment in a severely run-down, gritty suburb of Portland. It was barely 450 square feet of dilapidated space. The faded yellow wallpaper was peeling off in large strips in the corners. The warped wooden floors creaked aggressively with every single step I took, and the single-pane window in the living room rattled constantly, letting in a bitter, freezing draft no matter how tightly I stuffed old towels and duct tape along the rotting sill. The kitchen was practically a hallway. It was so narrow I could easily touch the humming, ancient refrigerator and the grease-stained stove at the exact same time just by stretching out my arms. But when I turned the key in that cheap, flimsy brass lock on the very first night, I dropped my bags, leaned heavily against the door, and smiled until my cheeks hurt. It was dirty, it was freezing, but it was the very first space in the world that I could truly, legally call my own. I dragged a scratched, second-hand wooden table I had found abandoned on the curb into the corner of the living room, directly under the only working electrical outlet, and proudly declared it my corporate headquarters. Every single morning, without fail, I woke up at 5 o'clock, brewed the absolute cheapest generic coffee I could find in a faded, plastic drip machine, and immediately got to work. Because I couldn't afford to run the central heater, I sat in that freezing room completely wrapped in 2 thick, itchy wool blankets, wearing fingerless gloves, coding tirelessly until my joints were stiff and the dim streetlights outside finally flickered on. My initial business idea was straightforward, born out of the gigs I used to do in secret, helping local artisans, crafters, and small independent shops manage their online orders and digital presence. I called the company Craft Logic. I spent my days building custom, lightweight websites and managing their messy digital inventory. In those grueling early weeks, I coded the back-end systems by day and sent hundreds of personalized, desperate cold emails by night. I lived entirely on a strict, depressing diet of 99-cent cup noodles, hard-boiled eggs, and bulk cans of baked beans. I lost a significant amount of weight. The dark, heavy circles under my eyes looked like permanent, purple bruises. Months dragged by, and the harsh, unforgiving reality of absolute poverty began to sink its sharp teeth deep into my skin. By November, the Oregon winter had fully set in, and Craft Logic had exactly 2 consistent, paying clients. One was Winston, an incredibly sweet, legally blind 80-year-old woodcarver who lived a 40-minute drive away. He didn't understand the internet at all. He thought a browser was a type of encyclopedia. He called me the computer girl and constantly forgot my name, calling me Sarah or Emily, but every single month, He faithfully handed me a crumpled $20 bill to keep his little digital storefront running. The other client was Gemma, a stressed-out mother of three who made organic, lavender-scented soaps out of her cramped garage. She paid me $30 a month via a mailed check. $50. That was my entire, recurring monthly corporate revenue. It was barely enough to cover my essential electric bill, and that was only if I kept the apartment heater turned completely off for 20 hours a day. Every single night, lying fully clothed on my cheap, lumpy mattress directly on the floor, I stared up at the ugly brown water stains on the ceiling and fought back a creeping, suffocating panic attack. The $4,000 in savings I had proudly brought with me were evaporating significantly faster than I had ever calculated. Rent, server hosting fees, internet access, basic groceries. It was a constant, exhausting, terrifying math problem that never balanced in my favor. I was working 14-hour days, 7 days a week, entirely alone, completely isolated from everyone I had ever known, just to literally keep the lights from being shut off by the utility company. Some incredibly dark nights, the silence of that tiny apartment was so overwhelmingly loud it made my ears ring. I would inevitably think about my parents' massive, warm house. I would picture the overflowing stainless steel refrigerator, the soft, comfortable bed with down pillows, the sheer lack of financial terror. I knew, deep down, that all I had to do was pick up my cheap prepaid phone, call my mother, apologize profusely, agree to enroll in whatever prestigious college they demanded, and the struggle would instantly end. I could be warm tomorrow. But then, closing my eyes, I would vividly remember my father's roaring, hateful voice echoing off the dining room walls, calling me a worthless parasite. The fire in my chest would instantly reignite, burning away the cold. I violently swore to myself that I would rather freeze to death in this miserable apartment than ever let them own my life again. I genuinely thought sheer, stubborn willpower would be enough to push me through the brutal winter. I thought if I just worked significantly harder, slept even less, and sent 50 more cold emails a day to local businesses, the universe would eventually reward me and things would magically turn around. But the universe absolutely does not care about your work ethic or your inspiring underdog story when you have absolutely zero financial safety net. The catastrophic breaking point happened on a gloomy Tuesday morning in late February. The city roads were dangerously slick with invisible black ice. I was driving my rusty, loud sedan across town to physically drop off a heavy box of newly printed shipping labels for Gemma because she couldn't figure out her printer. I was stopped at a long red light at a major, busy intersection. I was shivering violently because the car's internal heater had completely broken down a week prior, and I was mentally calculating if I could afford to buy a cheap jar of peanut butter that week to add some protein to my noodle diet. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a massive, terrifying jolt violently threw my entire body forward. The horrific sound of crunching metal, shattering taillights, and twisting steel filled the small cabin. The seatbelt locked painfully hard against my chest and collarbone, completely knocking the wind out of me. My head snapped back against the headrest. A heavy, commercial pickup truck had completely failed to brake in time on the ice and rear-ended my small car at nearly full speed. I sat there in the driver's seat for a few agonizing seconds, completely stunned, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers were numb. I quickly checked myself. I wasn't bleeding. Nothing felt broken. But when I shakily tried to turn the ignition after exchanging insurance information with the very apologetic, panicked truck driver, the engine just made a horrible, grinding, metallic noise and completely died. Smoke began to pour out from under the hood. It adamantly refused to start. The emergency tow truck driver dropped me and my ruined, crumpled car off at a grim, oil-stained local mechanic shop. I sat in the freezing, greasy waiting area on a torn plastic chair for over an hour before the head mechanic walked over, wiping his dirty hands on a greasy rag. He looked at me with pity. The frame of the car was severely bent, the rear axle was entirely damaged, and the radiator was cracked. The absolute minimum repair estimate to make it barely drivable again was $800. $800. He honestly might as well have said $8 million. I pulled out my phone and checked my banking app. I had exactly $14.60 in my checking account. I thanked the mechanic, my voice completely hollow and dead, grabbed my backpack, and walked out into the freezing, relentless rain. I walked over 3 miles back to my apartment. I couldn't even afford a bus ticket. My cheap, worn-out canvas shoes soaked through completely within the first 5 minutes. By the time I finally climbed the 3 exhausting flights of stairs and unlocked my door, my lips were blue and I was shivering uncontrollably. The apartment was freezing as always. I dropped my bag and collapsed right onto the hard floor in the middle of the living room, completely surrounded by empty boxes, rolls of packing tape, and tall stacks of red-stamped unpaid bills. The sheer, crushing weight of absolutely everything crashed down on my shoulders all at once. The constant, gnawing hunger, the deep, bone-chilling cold, the extreme isolation, the total, undeniable failure of my business. I was a pathetic high school dropout sitting on a dirty floor with no car, no money, no friends, and absolutely zero prospects. For the very first time since I proudly left home, my resolve completely broke. I pulled my wet knees tightly to my chest and sobbed hysterically until my throat was raw and my eyes burned. In a moment of pure, blinding, irrational desperation, I reached for my phone. I just wanted anyone, to tell me it was going to be okay. I needed a mother. I desperately dialed Margaret's number. It rang 4 agonizing times before she finally picked up. Hello. Margaret's voice was crisp, annoyed, and incredibly businesslike. Mom, I whispered, my voice cracking. My teeth were chattering so loudly I could barely speak. Mom, it's Sloan. I got into a bad car accident today. I'm physically okay, but my car is completely totaled and I don't have any money for food or rent. There was a long, heavy pause on the line. I waited desperately for the basic maternal instinct to kick in. I waited for her to ask if I was hurt or if I needed her to come get me. Instead, she sighed a long, incredibly heavy sigh of pure disappointment. Sloan, your father and I explicitly told you this would happen. Life in the real world isn't a fun little game. Are you finally ready to admit you were wrong, come home, apologize to your father, and immediately enroll in the local community college? Mom, please, I just need a small, temporary loan to fix my car. Just to keep working my business. I swear I'll pay you back with interest next month. Absolutely not, she said, her voice turning completely freezing, devoid of any warmth. We are absolutely not funding this ridiculous, childish rebellion of yours. When you are truly ready to be a responsible adult and strictly follow the path we meticulously set for you, our door is open. Until then, do not call this house asking for handouts. We are done. She hung up the phone. The line went dead with a sharp click. I sat there, completely frozen, staring at the cracked screen of my phone as it slowly faded to black. That was the exact, defining moment the last remaining, pathetic shred of hope I had for my family completely evaporated. I wasn't a human daughter to them. I was a failed vanity project. And since the project had failed to yield prestige, I was casually discarded into the trash. I slowly wiped my wet face, stood up on shaking, tired legs, and swore an unbreakable oath to myself that I would never, ever, for as long as I lived, ask anyone for help again. The next 2 grueling days were an absolute blur of numb, mechanical survival. I walked absolutely everywhere in the biting, relentless cold because I had no other choice. I seriously considered giving up my dream entirely. I looked at applications for a minimum wage job flipping burgers at a fast food joint down the street just to guarantee I could pay my upcoming rent and not end up sleeping on a park bench. But on Thursday evening, while trying to warm my hands inside a local, independent coffee shop, I saw a brightly colored flyer pinned to a messy community corkboard. It was heavily advertising a free networking meetup for local small business owners and tech enthusiasts at the downtown public library. I really didn't want to go. I felt like an absolute fraud, a spectacular failure masquerading as an entrepreneur. But the flyer prominently promised free hot coffee and assorted pastries, and the library was guaranteed to be heated. I put on my only clean, mildly presentable sweater and walked the 2 miles to the downtown library. The designated conference room was overly bright with harsh fluorescent lights and smelled faintly of old carpet and floor wax. There were about 30 people there, mostly older folks in business casual attire talking loudly about outdated retail marketing strategies. I quietly grabbed a stale blueberry muffin and a cup of black coffee, retreating to stand silently in the very back corner, hoping to remain completely invisible. The keynote guest speaker that night was a woman named Sylvia. She was a striking woman in her late 50s, wearing a perfectly tailored, sharp navy suit. She had striking silver hair neatly tied back and piercing, incredibly intelligent, no-nonsense eyes. She was the founder and CEO of a highly successful, mid-sized accounting software firm based in Seattle. When she began speaking about the complex realities of scaling a digital product and finding true product-market fit, the entire room went completely, respectfully silent. She wasn't using buzzwords. She was brilliant, practical, and ruthlessly efficient. When her presentation ended and the crowd slowly began to thin out, my heart started pounding erratically against my ribs. This was a completely terrifying, irrational idea, but I knew with absolute certainty I had to talk to her. I nervously walked up to the front of the room, clutching my cheap, flimsy, homemade business card. My hands were visibly shaking as I cleared my throat and introduced myself. I told her I ran a digital platform helping local artisans sell online. I swallowed my pride and openly admitted I had no college degree, absolutely zero funding, and no real business training, but I proudly stated that I had built the entire software architecture myself from scratch. Sylvia looked at me. She didn't roll her eyes or dismiss me like my parents would have. She pointed to a chair and simply asked me to open my laptop. I nervously booted up my cracked screen, the fan immediately screaming, and showed her the complex back-end code I had painstakingly written to manage Winston and Gemma's daily inventories and shipping logic. She put on her reading glasses and studied the glowing screen in total silence for 3 agonizing, sweat-inducing minutes. Then she looked up, her expression completely serious and unwavering. "Your raw code is incredibly clean," Sylvia said, her voice steady. "The database architecture is surprisingly scalable, but your overall business model is completely, fundamentally garbage." I blinked, instantly taken aback, feeling a flush of embarrassment hit my cheeks. "You are selling a $20 a month subscription to sweet grandmas making soap in their cramped kitchens," she continued bluntly, tapping my screen. "You are doing highly complex, enterprise-level coding for absolute pocket change. You don't need 50 more individual, broke sellers, Sloan. You need business-to-business clients. B2B. Look at this infrastructure. Why on earth are you selling one single order management tool to one confused woodcarver, when you can sell this exact entire supply chain management system to a massive retail chain with 50 different store locations? They have the massive budgets. They have the massive pain points regarding inventory tracking. You have the exact, powerful software they desperately need. You just don't know how to package it or pitch it." It was as if someone had taken a massive, heavy sledgehammer to a thick brick wall in my brain. The blinding light flooded in. She was absolutely, undeniably right. I was thinking incredibly small. I was acting exactly like a terrified, insecure teenager trying to make allowance money instead of acting like the capable software architect I actually was. Sylvia and I sat in that library conference room until the night janitor literally kicked us out to lock the doors. She gave me a brutal, completely honest, step-by-step breakdown of exactly how to drastically restructure my pitch deck, how to aggressively target corporate operations managers instead of crafters, and how to confidently price my software in the tens of thousands of dollars, not the tens of dollars. I practically sprinted the entire 2 miles back to my freezing apartment. I didn't sleep a wink for 3 consecutive days. I completely tore down the amateur front end of my platform and meticulously rebuilt it as a sleek, professional, high-end enterprise supply chain management tool. I permanently changed the company name to Craft Logic Solutions. It sounded authoritative. It sounded incredibly expensive. I knew, however, I couldn't execute the massive enterprise pivot entirely alone. I desperately needed a polished, highly professional user interface to match my robust backend code. I went back to a different community tech meetup the next week and met Felix. He was a brilliant but completely broke university UX design student who was currently living on his friend's lumpy couch. We met at a cheap, greasy diner. I told him straight up I couldn't offer him a single dime of salary. Instead, I boldly offered him 20% equity in a company that currently made exactly $50 a month, and I promised to personally buy him all the cheap ramen he could physically eat. Felix looked deeply at my code, saw the massive potential vision, smiled, and shook my hand firmly. We dragged a cracked whiteboard I found in a local dumpster into my tiny kitchen and leaned it precariously against the humming fridge. We used empty boxes of instant noodles as makeshift monitor stands. It was incredibly scrappy. It was exhausting, but in that freezing, 450-square-foot apartment, the true, unbreakable foundation of my massive empire was finally, truly being built. I stopped crying about my parents. I stopped feeling sorry for my circumstances. I was going to absolute war. Thank you so much for watching part 1 of this story. If you're enjoying it so far, please take a quick moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, drop a comment below and tell me the name of the city you are living in right now. Every single comment helps push this video to more people. Thank you so much for your support, and I will see you in the next part. The absolute hardest part about shifting to a massive enterprise business model wasn't the complex coding, it was the suffocating, relentless wall of rejection. Felix and I worked out of my freezing 450-square-foot apartment like two people desperately trying to defuse a bomb. We completely redesigned the user interface, making it look incredibly sleek, authoritative, and corporate. Once the product was ready, I began sending out highly targeted emails to the operations managers of mid-sized retail chains across the entire West Coast. The silence was absolutely deafening. For the first 2 months, we got nothing but immediate rejections or completely ignored emails. Some managers actually took the time to reply just to ask what university I had graduated from, and when I honestly replied that I had no college degree, the communication would instantly and permanently cease. One particularly arrogant executive actually replied with a laughing emoji and told me to come back when I was a real professional. Every single rejection felt like my father's voice echoing in my head, telling me I was a worthless parasite who was destined to fail. But I simply could not afford to stop. I was surviving on plain rice and sheer, unadulterated spite. The monumental breakthrough finally came in early September. I had sent a desperate, highly detailed pitch to the operations department of a rapidly expanding handcrafted furniture chain called Maple & Sage. They had 36 retail locations across 6 different states and were severely struggling with outdated, incredibly slow inventory management software from the early 2000s. Their director of operations, a woman named Rebecca, replied to my email. She didn't ask for my high school diploma or my college transcripts. She simply wrote, "If your software can actually track multi-location inventory in real time without crashing, I want to see a live demo on Tuesday." Felix and I didn't sleep for 4 consecutive days. We built a flawless, customized live simulation specifically using their public product data. When Tuesday arrived, I couldn't even afford a proper business suit. I borrowed an oversized, slightly faded blazer from a girl down the hall and used black marker to cover up the scuff marks on my cheap shoes. The meeting was done over a video call. I sat at my wobbly wooden table, positioned the camera carefully so they couldn't see the peeling wallpaper behind me, and delivered the pitch of my entire life. I answered every single one of their complex technical questions with absolute, unwavering confidence. 2 weeks later, they flew me out to their corporate headquarters in Denver. I walked into a massive, glass-walled boardroom with a breathtaking view of the mountains. I stood tall, ignoring my pounding heart, and closed the deal. The final, signed contract was for an astonishing $420,000, with a massive upfront payment of $150,000 to begin the immediate implementation. When the wire transfer officially hit my completely empty bank account a few days later, I sat on the floor of my apartment and stared at the unbelievable string of zeros on my cracked phone screen. I didn't cheer. I didn't pop champagne. I simply laid my head back against the cold wall, closed my eyes, and took my very first full, deep breath in over a year. That single contract changed the entire trajectory of my life. I officially incorporated Craft Logic Solutions in Oregon. I moved out of that freezing, miserable apartment and rented a real, professional office space in a nice district. I hired Felix full-time with a massive salary increase. Within just 2 years, we secured massive contracts with 3 more national retail chains. We expanded to employ over 50 brilliant software engineers, and our annual revenue exploded into the multi-millions. I was no longer a terrified, starving dropout. I was the CEO of a rapidly growing tech empire. By my 5th year in business, Craft Logic Solutions had evolved into an absolute juggernaut within the artisan and specialty retail sector. Our platform handled billions of dollars in daily transactions, complex shipping logistics, and predictive customer analytics for over 60 different retail chains. Venture capitalist firms from Silicon Valley were constantly aggressively calling my office, throwing staggering valuation numbers at me. In our latest private funding round, the company was officially valued at over $45 million, and as the sole founder and majority shareholder, my personal net worth skyrocketed into a stratosphere I couldn't have previously comprehended. Yet, despite the massive, life-altering wealth accumulating in my investment accounts, I maintained an incredibly strict, almost paranoid level of personal anonymity. The tech magazines called me a visionary, but to my family back in Salem, I was still the exact same pathetic, disappointing failure who had stormed out of their house years ago. I lived a deeply fractured double life. Every single year for the Christmas holidays, I would intentionally rent the absolute cheapest, most beat-up economy car available at the Portland airport. I would wear my old, faded jeans and a cheap, unbranded winter coat. I would drive down to my parents' massive house and sit quietly at their dining table, enduring their endless, passive-aggressive remarks. My mother would inevitably ask, with a heavy sigh of pity, if I was still struggling with my little internet hobby, and I would just nod meekly and say it was paying the bills. I let them believe I was barely scraping by. I let Penelope brag endlessly about her high-paying medical residency and her new, wealthy husband, Thomas. Why did I do it? Why didn't I just show up in a chauffeur-driven limousine and rub my massive success in their judgmental faces? Because I knew, with absolute certainty, that the second they realized I had millions of dollars, their entire narrative would instantly flip. They wouldn't suddenly love me for who I was, they would only love the money. They would try to claim credit for my success. I wanted to protect my peace, and I wanted to keep my wealth completely uncontaminated by their toxic expectations. But the constant pressure of running a massive company and maintaining that exhausting facade took a heavy psychological toll on me. I needed a sanctuary. I needed a place where I could breathe completely free from the freezing rain of Oregon and the cold, judgmental shadows of my past. So, working through incredibly complex, blind legal trusts to completely mask my identity, I purchased a private island in the beautiful Florida Keys. The purchase price was a staggering $72 million. It was a completely secluded, breathtaking piece of paradise surrounded by crystal-clear, turquoise water. It featured a stunning, modern glass and steel architectural masterpiece of a house, completely self-sustaining with high-tech solar grids, a private boat dock, and a helicopter landing pad. I hired a top-tier interior designer to fill it with bright, warm, minimalist furniture. There were no framed diplomas on the walls. There was only light, ocean breeze, and absolute, undeniable proof that I had fundamentally won the game of life on my own terms. Whenever the stress of the corporate world became too much, I would secretly fly down there, walk barefoot on my own private, pristine white sand beach, and simply listen to the ocean waves. It was my $72 million fortress of solitude. The twisted, complex irony of my massive, secret success was that while my empire was rapidly expanding across the country, my parents' perfectly curated, prestigious life was completely falling apart at the seams. It happened quite suddenly during my 6th year of business. The state university where my father had taught for nearly 30 years implemented severe, sweeping budget cuts. His entire political science department was ruthlessly downsized, and at the age of 61, Richard was abruptly, forcibly pushed into early retirement. He lost his massive salary and, more importantly, he lost his prestigious identity. Less than a month later, my mother, Margaret, was diagnosed with a highly complex autoimmune thyroid disorder. The specialized, aggressive treatment she desperately required was considered experimental and was absolutely not covered by their standard academic health insurance policy. The out-of-pocket medical bills were astronomical. I found out about their dire situation through a frantic, accidental email my mother forwarded to an old address I still monitored. Attached was a severely past-due mortgage statement from their bank. They were nearly 90 days behind on the massive loan for their beautiful, perfectly decorated house. Foreclosure was imminent. I sat in my massive, luxurious corner office overlooking the Portland skyline, staring at that digitized bank statement for hours. My heart was a complicated, tangled mess of conflicting emotions. I knew for a fact that they had reached out to their golden child, Penelope, begging for financial assistance. And I also knew, through the family grapevine, that Penelope and Thomas had flat out refused to help. Penelope claimed she was absolutely swamped with the expensive daycare costs for her new twins and the massive mortgage on her own new luxury house in Seattle. When things got hard, the perfect daughter completely abandoned them. The logical, self-preserving part of my brain screamed at me to close the laptop and let them sink. They had thrown me out into the freezing cold. They had called me a worthless parasite. They had actively hoped for my failure. Letting the bank take their precious house would be the ultimate, poetic karma. But I couldn't do it. Despite all the horrific emotional abuse, I couldn't stomach the thought of my aging parents being thrown out onto the street, bankrupt and sick. However, I absolutely refused to hand them a check directly. I refused to let them know I was their savior. I immediately called my brilliant corporate attorney, Harrison. I instructed him to set up a highly complex, virtually untraceable web of anonymous shell companies and blind trusts registered in states with strict corporate secrecy laws. We created a fake charitable organization called Spring Hill Holding. Within a week, Spring Hill Holding quietly contacted my parents' aggressive mortgage lender and completely paid off all their massive arrears, continuing to pay the monthly installments directly to the bank. My parents received a highly formal letter stating that an anonymous educational philanthropic group was stepping in to assist them due to their decades of valuable contribution to public education. They eagerly swallowed the lie without a single question. Then, we established another shell company called Brightstone Consulting out of Boise. Through Harrison, Brightstone officially hired my father to write a completely useless, fictional manuscript for a modern civic education curriculum. They offered him a monthly consulting salary of exactly $2,000. It was entirely fake, but Richard's massive ego couldn't handle the truth of being unemployed, so he proudly accepted. He even started bragging to his country club friends that he was now a highly paid, elite educational consultant. I also quietly set up 2 massive, anonymous scholarships to entirely cover the exorbitant preschool tuition for Penelope's twins, just to ensure the whole family stayed financially afloat. Every single month, I sat at my sleek desk and quietly authorized the massive wire transfers to keep their entire fake, comfortable reality completely intact. I was spending over $10,000 a month on people who fundamentally despised me. It was a deeply sick, twisted power dynamic, but it was mine to control. I maintained this incredibly complex, deeply stressful financial illusion for nearly 4 agonizing years. I poured well over $120,000 of my own hard-earned money into their mortgages, their expensive medications, and their ridiculous fake salaries. All the while, I continued my annual, masochistic tradition of returning home for the holidays in my cheap rental car, wearing my worn-out clothes, strictly playing the role of the struggling, unremarkable disappointment. The absolute final breaking point, the moment I finally decided to detonate the entire charade, happened on a remarkably gloomy, rain-soaked Thanksgiving Day in Salem. I was now 26 years old. My company was preparing for a massive public offering. I had just spent the previous weekend relaxing on my massive private island, but now I was pulling a rusty rental sedan into my parents' driveway. I walked through the heavy front door carrying my old, beat-up canvas backpack. The house smelled exactly as it always did, a mixture of expensive roasted turkey, pine cones, and thick, suffocating hypocrisy. My mother, Margaret, was bustling around the kitchen, barking orders. My father, Richard, was sitting comfortably in his expensive leather armchair, reading the business section of the newspaper, looking completely relaxed thanks to the fake consulting salary I was personally depositing into his account every month. He gave me a brief, completely dismissive nod instead of a greeting. Penelope was already there, dressed immaculately, looking like she had just stepped out of a high-end medical lifestyle magazine. Her husband, Thomas, was aggressively unbuckling their noisy twins from their car seats. As I walked past them, Thomas grabbed his son's hand and pulled him away from my bag. "Let's not let the kids mess with Aunt Sloane's dirty backpack," Thomas whispered loudly, fully intending for me to hear him. "Nobody wants their kid learning how to be a broke tech support worker by age 3. Penelope giggled softly. Margaret pretended not to hear. I didn't react outwardly. I just offered a tight, forced smile and walked into the dining room. But inside my backpack, pressed firmly against my laptop, was a thick, glossy, 40-page color-printed dossier compiled by my legal team. Dinner commenced exactly at 6 o'clock. We all sat around the same massive oak table where my father had verbally destroyed my life 8 years ago. As usual, the conversation was completely dominated by Penelope's recent promotion to chief resident at the hospital and Thomas's brilliant new stock portfolio investments. Then came the agonizing tradition of the Thanksgiving toast. Richard stood up, raising his crystal glass of expensive red wine. He delivered a booming, incredibly arrogant 5-minute speech. He praised Penelope for her flawless dedication to saving lives. He praised Thomas for being the ideal, intellectual son-in-law. He even praised himself, loudly bragging about the lucrative consulting work he was doing for a prestigious firm out of Boise, claiming his brilliant academic mind was still in incredibly high demand. He looked around the table, making deep eye contact with everyone except me. He intentionally, aggressively looked right past my face as if I were a ghost. As he finally sat down to carve the massive turkey, Margaret looked over at me with a heavily practiced look of deep, maternal pity. "So, Sloane," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "Are you still managing to scrape by with that little internet hobby of yours? Thomas's firm is always hiring entry-level data entry clerks if you ever decide you want a real, stable job." I looked around the beautifully decorated table. I looked at the expensive food, the crystal glasses, the warm lights. I realized with absolute, terrifying clarity that they had learned absolutely nothing from their financial ruin. The money I had secretly provided hadn't humbled them, it had completely enabled their toxic arrogance. They were still exactly the same cruel, judgmental bullies they had always been. The only difference was that now, I was the one secretly paying for the stage they were performing on. I reached down, unzipped my worn canvas backpack, and pulled out the heavy, glossy folder. The time for hiding was officially over. I gently, deliberately placed the thick stack of printed documents directly onto the center of the oak table, right next to the expensive gravy boat. The dull thud made everyone stop talking. "I actually have something I'd like to share today," I said, my voice eerily calm and completely steady. Margaret paused her serving, frowning deeply as if I had just rudely burped at the table. Penelope glanced at the thick papers, her lips pressed tightly together with immediate suspicion. Richard looked highly annoyed by the interruption. I reached out, pulled the top sheet from the stack, and laid it wide open in front of my father. It was a pristine, high-resolution copy of the latest centerfold feature from TechBridge Weekly magazine. The massive, bold headline took up half the page, accompanied by a professional studio photograph of me standing in my corporate headquarters. It read, Sloan, founder and CEO of Craft Logic Solutions, the tech visionary reshaping America's artisan market. Below it, the article clearly detailed the company's recent $45 million valuation. My father picked up the magazine printout, his eyes scanning the text. He flipped it over, inspecting the edges as if he were actively searching for signs of a cheap Photoshop forgery. He let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "What is this nonsense?" he demanded, tossing the paper back onto the table. "Where did you print this garbage? Are you trying to play some kind of pathetic prank on us?" A college dropout with absolutely no credentials suddenly magically becomes a software multimillionaire? You can lie to your little internet friends, Sloan, but do not insult our intelligence. "It is not a prank, Dad," I replied softly, leaning forward. "I have been running Craft Logic for over 8 years. We employ over 200 people, and that wealth is very real. But that's not even the most interesting part of the story." I opened the heavy folder further. I began methodically dealing the documents across the table like playing cards. "Mom, Dad," I continued, my voice gaining volume, cutting through their rising confusion. "I am the sole benefactor behind every single bit of financial support this family has mysteriously received over the past 4 years." I slid the bank transfer records toward them. "These are the highly confidential transfer logs from Spring Hill Holding directly to your mortgage lender. I have been paying the massive loan on this house every single month, so you wouldn't be thrown out onto the street." Margaret's face instantly went completely pale. She dropped her serving spoon. I pulled out the medical documents. "These are the private trust payments covering all of your expensive experimental thyroid medications, Mom. Without them, you would be incredibly sick right now." Then I looked directly into my father's furious eyes and slid the final contract across the polished wood. "And this, Dad, is the highly confidential incorporation paperwork for Brightstone Consulting in Boise. It is a completely fake shell company I created with my lawyers. Your prestigious curriculum consulting job does not exist. Your incredibly important manuscript is going straight into a digital trash can. I created that fake job to give you a $2,000 allowance every month so your fragile ego wouldn't completely shatter when the university threw you out." The dining room completely froze. The silence was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. You could hear the rain aggressively lashing against the dining room windows. Richard pushed his heavy chair back so violently it tipped over and crashed onto the hardwood floor. He stood up, his face an alarming shade of dark purple. His chest was heaving. He couldn't process the reality that the daughter he openly despised was his literal savior. His massive, fragile pride simply could not handle the devastating humiliation. "You are a lying fraud," he screamed, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face, reverting instantly to the exact same rage from 8 years ago. "This is completely fabricated. Or worse, you're involved in something deeply illegal. Someone like you, a pathetic dropout, could only ever get this kind of money through deceit and criminal activity. You are a disgrace to this family, bringing dirty money into my house." Penelope chimed in, her voice shrill with intense, ugly jealousy. "He's right. I worked 14-hour shifts in the emergency room to earn my respected title. You just sit at home typing on a keyboard, and you expect us to believe you're some genius CEO? It's laughable." I looked at them. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just felt an overwhelming, profound sense of absolute exhaustion. They were completely, fundamentally broken people. "I stayed quiet for years," I said, my voice completely cold and detached. "I funded your entire lives anonymously because I genuinely thought this family needed to keep its precious pride intact to survive. But I am so incredibly tired. I am tired of hiding my massive success just to be barely tolerated in this toxic house. You don't want the real me. You just want the pathetic, failed version of me that you completely made up in your heads so you can feel vastly superior." Margaret suddenly reached out, her hands shaking violently. The reality of the financial documents had finally breached her denial. "Sloan," she whispered, her voice trembling with absolute terror. "Sloan, please, what about the mortgage payment for next month? The bank will foreclose immediately." I looked down at the woman who had refused to give me an $800 loan when I was starving and freezing. I calmly gathered my documents, placed them neatly back into my canvas backpack, and zipped it up. "Mom," I said, my voice barely a whisper, yet carrying the absolute weight of a finalized execution. "People who see me as a worthless parasite and a criminal disgrace can no longer continue living a life of luxury funded entirely by my money. As of this exact second, every single account is frozen. The charity is permanently over." I turned my back on them, walked straight out of the dining room, opened the heavy front door, and stepped out into the freezing, pouring rain. This time, I didn't look back. I didn't stay in Oregon a single minute longer than absolutely necessary. I drove the cheap rental car straight to Portland International Airport, dropped the keys on the rental counter, and walked directly to the private aviation terminal. Within 2 hours, I was sitting in the plush leather seat of a chartered jet, watching the thick, miserable gray clouds of the Pacific Northwest rapidly dissolve beneath me. I drank a glass of incredibly expensive champagne and watched the sun rise. I felt lighter than I had in my entire life. The massive, suffocating anchor of my toxic family had finally been completely severed. By early afternoon, the jet touched down in the warm, blindingly bright sunshine of Florida. A private car drove me to the heavily guarded marina, where my personal speedboat was waiting. As the boat skipped across the stunning, crystal-clear turquoise waters of the Keys, approaching my massive, secluded island, I stood on the deck and simply let the warm ocean wind tear through my hair. When I finally stepped off the wooden dock and my bare feet touched the warm, powdery white sand of my own $72 million property, the sheer reality of my absolute freedom washed over me. I walked up to the stunning glass house. There were no arguments echoing in the massive hallways. There were no judgmental eyes monitoring my every single move. There was only the soothing, rhythmic sound of the ocean waves and the beautiful, undeniable truth that I had built this entire sanctuary with my own 2 hands and my own brilliant mind. I spent the first 2 weeks completely offline. I swam in the warm ocean, I read books on the expansive wooden deck, and I finally, truly slept without grinding my teeth. When I eventually decided to reconnect with the outside world, I started attending small, exclusive tech charity events in Miami, completely dropping the pathetic, struggling dropout facade. I wore my expensive watches and tailored dresses. It was at one of these quiet charity dinners that I met Julian. He was a brilliant, incredibly kind cybersecurity consultant who spent half his time doing pro bono digital protection work for environmental nonprofits. He had a warm, genuine smile and eyes that actually listened when I spoke. The most beautiful part was that he had absolutely no idea about my massive net worth or my island when we first met. He just liked talking to me about complex server architecture and bad science fiction movies. We spent hours walking along the beach, eating cheap tacos from local food trucks, and simply being entirely ourselves. For the very first time in my life, I was building a relationship based entirely on mutual respect and genuine connection, not on terrifying expectations or financial leverage. I finally had a real partner. The catastrophic fallout in Oregon was swift and absolutely brutal. I had instructed Harrison to execute the termination of all financial support flawlessly. The anonymous Spring Hill Holding Trust officially ceased all mortgage payments on the massive Salem house. Brightstone Consulting abruptly terminated its fake consulting contract with Richard, citing a complete change in corporate direction. The massive, anonymous preschool scholarships for Penelope's twins were officially marked as non-renewable for the upcoming semester. It didn't take long for the harsh, unforgiving reality of the real world to completely crush them. Without my secret, massive influx of cash, the bank aggressively foreclosed on their heavily mortgaged house within 4 months. Richard and Margaret were forcefully evicted and had to drastically downsize, moving into a cramped, depressing 2-bedroom apartment in an undesirable part of town. Penelope, suddenly faced with the massive reality of paying for her own luxurious lifestyle, stopped returning their frantic phone calls. Soon after, the desperate letters started arriving at my corporate headquarters. Thick, handwritten envelopes from Richard and Margaret. Suddenly, their tone had miraculously changed. The letters were filled with desperate, flowing praise. They wrote about how they always knew I was a brilliant visionary, how they were so incredibly proud of their wildly successful CEO daughter, and how they desperately wanted to heal the family rift and be a real family again. I sat on the sun-drenched deck of my island sanctuary, reading their pathetic, manipulative words. I didn't feel a single ounce of anger anymore. I didn't even feel the urge to write back and gloat. I just felt a profound, overwhelming sense of sad pity. They didn't miss their daughter. They missed their anonymous ATM machine. They were only apologizing because they were utterly broke. I slowly shredded the letters and threw them in the recycling bin. I realized that true, ultimate healing doesn't necessarily come from receiving a genuine apology, and it certainly doesn't come from forgiving people who actively tried to destroy you. True healing comes from realizing you have the absolute power to simply walk away and build a vastly superior life without them. Instead of dwelling on the past, I focused my immense resources on the future. I officially launched the Forge Forward Grant, a massive, multi-million-dollar philanthropic foundation dedicated entirely to providing $20,000 no-strings-attached grants and intense business mentorship to brilliant young tech founders who, just like me, did not have college degrees and were completely ignored by traditional investors. On the day we announced the first 50 grant recipients, I stood on a massive stage, looked out at a crowd of passionate, unconventional thinkers, and realized I had finally found my true family. I built my massive tech empire from the absolute ground up, surviving freezing nights and starvation, and then I silently paid my toxic parents massive debts when no one else in the world would help them. But walking away completely, letting them lose their precious house, and cutting off my own flesh and blood financially when they continually refused to respect me. Am I wrong? Should I have given them one last, desperate chance to be a real family now that they finally know the truth? Thank you so much for watching my story until the very end. If you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our daily, incredible stories. Drop your honest thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one of them. See you in the next video.